Hello and welcome. It's great that you're watching this video. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything about stenciling. Stenciling is a technique that you can use in many different ways. You use regular paper, but you might even be able to use it on skin. Today, I'm going to show you how to use stencils and how to make your own stencils. And I'll also share a few fun creative ideas that you might want to try yourself. First, I'm going to show you how to use stencils on paper. Just watch along. The very first technique I'm going to show you is the most commonly used technique with stenciling. And that's with a stencil like this one. Let me just take it out for a moment. I'll also put all the item numbers of the products I use in this video in the description. Just look at how beautiful this one is. Beautiful with those floral patterns. For this, I'm also immediately using the magnetic work mat. That's just ideal for stenciling because nothing shifts around. So I place my paper here and my stencil. I've made it just a bit wider than the stencil itself, so I can cut away the excess later. That way, I also get neater edges. I place my magnets on the stencil in such a way that it actually edge to edge. Now your stencil is really well positioned, neatly on the paper. Next, I grab our dowel bars. They're really great, especially for these kinds of very detailed stencils. I take the dowel bar. I'm right-handed, so it goes on my right index finger. Hold the cap in place. And then I actually start by swiping a bit over the cap. Press a little so your dowel bar is well saturated with cake. Because I want the color to be really intense as well. Then we try to do it a bit like this with this one. Look, a little to the side. And what do you do then? Especially with such a detailed stencil, you really need to press your dauber well into the edges. And then you go with a circular motion, you go over your stencil. So press well into your ink pad. I always like to hold on for a bit of certainty. I know it's really well secured, but it's always nice to have a bit of extra control so that your end product just looks really neat. Those little corners. So if you've really saturated it, you can also use more of a stamping technique here. But we're going to create a gradient here in a moment. And what's very important with a gradient is that the line doesn't become too harsh. So here you add a lot of ink, and the closer you get to the center or to where you want your gradient to be, you use less ink there. Apply it. So you'll also press much more lightly with your dauber. Press. And of course, I'm doing this with 2 colors, but it's also really fun to use different multiple colors. Maybe you can create a rainbow effect or something like that. That's also really nice. Then we're going to work from the bottom to the top. And now comes the final result. So what you see now is that even though you're using the stencil, you can still see the gradient in the ink beautifully. You can see the gradient in ink. And in this example, of course, I have left a bit of space. You can still see a little bit where I went over the stencil here with the dauber. So if you cut it out, for example, you'll get this effect. It looks really nice if you place a folded card behind it. Maybe add a fun sentiment, and then you're basically already done with it. Very beautiful card. For my second technique, you'll need, of course, a stencil. You don't necessarily need to use a magnetic work mat for this, because we're going to play around with a stencil a bit in a moment. These are watercolor pencils from Brunzio and a water brush. Very handy. You don't need to set out a little jar or anything. You can just get started right away. First, I pick up the blue pencil. And then I'm actually going to, this is especially easier if you have some simpler stencils. Because here, really piece by piece, I'm going to use circles. And then you basically just color in all the circles or flowers, or whatever kind of stencil you have. For this example, of course, I'm using watercolor pencils, but it's also just fun to use other types of pencils or markers. Then we take another color, and what we do is we're going to move the stencil. So we take it off and we can see exactly the circles we've made. And then I look for where I roughly want to place my other circles. I think this looks nice because I have a bit of overlap here with a few blue ones, since the blue is still clearly visible. Then we're going to do exactly the same thing again. Here's another good tip to share. I'm using a pencil that's already getting a bit blunt. If you really want to get into the corners of the stencil, use a sharp pencil for that, because that way you can get into those corners better. We've made all our little circles with the stencil. Now we take our water brush. I'm going to use it, and then you'll actually see that the texture of the pencil more or less disappears. So you really get a watercolor-like look. It is important though, if you use two colors, to clean your brush every now and then. Otherwise, it can get a bit muddy. And as you can see, this is a really fun technique to experiment with. Just take a look at the stencils you already have. Of course, this is just a fun way to create something like bubbles. But there are an incredible variety of different potential opportunities for the things you're able to achieve with this. Now, for the next example, we're going to work with acrylic paint. This is a layered stencil that I used for this. So I've already done the first layer with this stencil. For the next layer, you need to pay close attention. This little circle needs to be placed in the same spot as this little circle. So I know the first layer was here, so my second layer needs to go over this. Because there are organic shapes on the stencil, it doesn't really matter that much if it's just a millimeter to the left or right. But do pay more attention to that if you have a stencil with geometric shapes, or something like that, so that everything lines up a bit more closely. But for now, this is fine. I'm already placing the magnets so the stencil can't shift too much. I did the first layer with this Amsterdam acrylic paint in titanium white. And I'll do the next layer with this pink color. Then I grab a brush. It doesn't really matter what kind of brush it is. So if you have a stencil with really small details, then it's nice to have. To not use too big, not too large a brush. So I apply a bit in a stamping kind of way. I'll put a little bit of paint on my brush, but definitely not too much. And then you basically just carefully paint it in, at least when you are working on the larger areas of the surface, so that you really follow along with the stencil. So not against the plastic, but along with the plastic. That way you'll get a cleaner result. Sometimes you need to rotate your brush like this. Here we still have some smaller open areas. For those, it's actually easier to use more of a stamping technique. Then we've gone all the way around the stencil and we very carefully remove the magnets to lift it up a little bit. It's handy to do this because now the stencil is, of course, quite dirty, so don't wait too long to clean it. acrylic paint dries fairly quickly, after all. So it's also useful if it gets cleaned up again quickly. You can do this with a baby wipe or by rinsing it underwater. For my next technique, I'm going to use texture paste. Again, just like before, I make sure I have a bit more space around it so I can place another magnet. Another tip, first place your magnet in the middle of the sheet and then slide it outward. That way, you keep the paper a bit tighter. And then you use the ruler along the side. That way you actually keep it a bit flatter. The texture paste. And this one is actually quite coarse. So it's not suitable for all kinds of stencils, but I think for these kinds of nice, simple shapes, it works really well. This looks like so much fun. To get started, you will definitely need to have a clean spatula ready for this project. Then you carefully pick up a generous amount of thick texture paste with the edge of your spatula. And then you spread it over your stencil. And you do this over the entire stencil. So, it also really depends on the type of paste you have, how you need to go over the stencil. Because this one is very coarse and really has a grain, you really need to press it in a bit. And you can go over it a few times, because sometimes the layer gets left behind. And then it's really nice to go over it flat one more time, which allows you to spread the paste very smoothly and evenly over your stencil. Structure paste always needs to dry for a bit, so always keep that in mind when you're making something. I'm gonna set this aside for a moment, because once it's completely dry and you remove the stencil, I'll put it away for now. Then you will get a wonderful effect, just like this one. You can really see quite clearly how the coarse texture of the paint goes through the stencil beautifully and effectively. Then I take a large blending brush, and then I carefully begin the creative process by working with a specialized layer of Distress Oxide ink. Go over it with your brush, and then you go over your paper. I do that with a circular motion. That way you can actually get all sides. Ensuring that all of the elevated surface regions are thoroughly and effectively covered with ink. Then I use a second color to really saturate it, and then we'll work on the inside of the paper. What you actually see with this technique is that because the paper is porous, the ink is absorbed beautifully into it. But in the areas where there's texture paste, it doesn't really soak in completely. This texture paste is a bit coarser, so there will always be some ink left between the grains. If you use a texture paste that's a bit smoother, then once everything has dried, you can go over it with a dry cloth. And then you'll actually remove the ink from those areas. So then you get a really nice effect. You can really see the difference between where you use the stencil and where you applied the ink. Applied. That was the illustration. So if you apply this technique to this sheet for a bit longer, you'll actually get this result. Really beautiful, lots of depth. Just a really nice technique to use for all your paper hobbies. And for the next technique, we're going to use something you probably wouldn't expect at all with stencils, but I'm going to use my cutting and embossing machine. Here I'm using the Cut Easy. We have the base plate. On top of that, we place our cutting mat. Done. We take the sheet, which we basically want to emboss because that's actually the technique we're going to do. It's handy to always moisten it a little first, so that it's just lightly misted. We place that sheet on the cutting mat. Then comes the stencil. We place that on top. Next, the B plate. And to add a bit of extra pressure, I just put a sheet on top. Cardstock over it. You can always just use some scraps for this. They're perfect for that purpose. So you don't have to use new cardstock for it. Now we'll run it through the machine. Applying this technique also really depends on the machine you have, the stencil you use, and the type of cardstock. So experiment with it a bit. Just like that, through the machine. The cardstock will also curl quite a bit. If it curls, that means it's working. Because the stencil isn't very thick, the emboss effect will also be quite subtle. Because we're going to work on it in a moment, the effect will become more visible then. So here we have our sandwich, and we're going to take it out. And what you see now is very subtle. The effect of the stencil. In the paper, we take our soft blending tool and we carefully pick up a little bit of ink. And then we go over the impression. You can already see that it stays in place nicely. I do see, though, that I didn't get the water quite right. Spied it. So do pay attention when you're misting that not too many splatters end up on the paper. Or, of course, it could be a deliberate choice. Let's just say it was a choice. Here you actually have the center of the heart. Nicely applied with ink. A little tip. And then we remove this, grab our second color, and go along the edges. Look, now you can see that effect. It's really very beautiful. I really think it's a very fun technique. You can see now that it gives a very soft and fuzzy effect. It is truly and remarkably beautiful, possessing a profound sense of depth. The edges are nicely saturated. Now I'm switching again to the other color for a moment. Again, too. Get a nice effect. Look. And I'm not doing this now. Very neatly all around here, because in a moment I'm going to use the stencil again, in a different way. So you actually won't see the edges anymore. One light layer with the orange. There, look. You can see that here at the edges, it's actually not very neat. I've just gone over it, Gary. Loosely. But now I'm going to use the stencil in a different way. So I'll set this aside for a moment. And here I have a dark gray cardstock. You take the stencil again, you place it on the black sheet. And then you take I'm just using a white pen now, but you can also use a pencil, as long as you can see the lines clearly later. What you're gonna do is trace the outside of your stencil. Trace it. A small mistake. No one will notice it later. Now I've traced around the heart. Remove your stencil. And now you actually have exactly where your figure. You've now made a template of it. You cut this out, or use a craft knife, which is actually the easiest. Turn your sheet over, because this side often isn't quite as neat, or maybe you didn't cut one of the edges perfectly. It doesn't matter at all. And then place it exactly on your white sheet. The end result you get is this. I think it's really fun. A really nice creative way to use the stencil in a different way than you normally would. And another tip I want to give you is that you can also make your own stencils by using cutting dies or punches. You lay down your paper, you place your cutting die on top, and you simply cut it out. It is quite straightforward and simple. Instead of using this shape, you use this one. So you take your paper, you take your punch, you punch out the shape. Of course, this is a lot of space, so just cut or trim it off. And then you can use these as really fun stencils. This technique is quite unexpected because we're going to use stencils for face painting. Gently place the stencil on the face, for example on the cheek or near the eye. I'm holding it here on the cheek. Lightly dip the sponge into the face paint and then you need to dab it. For more depth, it's also really fun to add an extra color. Then, for example, move the stencil for this purpose. And when you're happy with what you've painted, you remove the stencil and you can make it even more fun. Dress it up, for example, with stick-on gems. Let everything dry thoroughly and check that everything is secure, then admire the result. As you can see, there are so many ways to use stencils. From very neat and precise to creative and experimental. I hope this video has inspired you to start stenciling yourself. All the products I used in this video can be found in the description below this video. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye-bye.